I'm live. Give a shout out to everybody who's been watching. Podcast yesterday did good views. The podcast Monday night did good views. Power punchers, and we're starting a daily podcast here, the Up Jab, and this is the second episode, man. And shout out to everybody on this episode. And a lot going on in the boxing world, and we got a heavy schedule coming from April to June, so not much to complain about, but there is something that's bothering me out there that I'm going to talk about today, and it's revisionist history, and it's revisionist history when it comes to Gennady Golovkin. The frustrating part about this for me is I'm a Canelo Alvarez fan. I see a lot of the revisionist history coming from Canelo Alvarez fans when it comes to Gennady Golovkin. It's frustrating because Canelo Alvarez, the hardcore fans, do this thing when it comes to Gennady Golovkin. And shout out to Canelo Alvarez. And I want to put this disclaimer out there quickly. And shout out to Boxing Learner. Y'all make sure to hit that like button as y'all come in. I want to put this disclaimer out there first and foremost. I'm a Canelo Alvarez fan. I'm a Canelo Alvarez fan much more so than Gennady Golovkin. I'm a Miguel Cotto fan much more so than Gennady Golovkin. I bring that up because some points will be made later when it comes to Cotto. I'm a Carl Froch fan much more so than I am a Gennady Golovkin fan. I bring that up because Carl Froch's name will come up later. But I got to keep it real. As I mentioned yesterday on the podcast, we need to push back on false narratives. We need to push back on lazy narratives, even when it comes to guys we don't necessarily like. For me, it was Jack Catterall a couple days ago. Nobody's taking up for poor Jack, who isn't going to get a shot likely at a mandatory for one of the 4 belts, when he should have the 4 belts, all 4 of them in his trophy case right now when Josh Taylor moves up. I don't want to get off topic, but I'm just making the point we have to push back on false narratives, even when it's inconvenient for us. But the problem with this for me, and the bothersome thing for me, is yes, Carl Froch was a warrior. The bothersome thing for me is Canelo Alvarez fans, it's actually a detriment to them to push down and put down Gennady Golovkin's legacy, especially when it doesn't make any sense. And I'll be laying out the facts. And I want to give the Canelo Alvarez fans, the hardcore fans who are trying to demean and devalue and push this false narrative that Gennady Golovkin was overhyped and just wasn't all that great. I want to give an alternative narrative that actually builds up Canelo Alvarez while giving the truth about Gennady Golovkin. And I understand why Canelo fans do this. I understand. Look, I've done it with certain fighters in the past. When a fan base is so annoying, you want to push back and you want to devalue the fighter of that fan base. And I think that's what the trap that the Canelo fans fall into when it comes to Gennady Golovkin. They don't really hate Gennady Golovkin. They hate Gennady Golovkin fanboys. So they take it out on Golovkin. But it actually demeans them in the process. And it devalues their fighter, because if we build up Gennady Golovkin to who he really is in this narrative, it actually builds up Canelo in the process. Because Canelo Alvarez, the fanboys who demean Gennady Golovkin, I'm not saying it's all of them, but it's a lot of them. They do this thing where they act like Canelo Alvarez had a career-defining victory against Gennady Golovkin in the second fight, but then the very next sentence, they say, oh, Gennady Golovkin was just a hype job. It doesn't work, man. It doesn't jive. It doesn't jive. So I'm going to give the real narrative and what it should be and the facts in this case. Is Gennady Golovkin overhyped? Absolutely not. Over time, there will be a correction. There will be a correction that will tell us if this guy was overhyped or not, especially if he's fighting tough competition. So if you fight Canelo Alvarez twice, we're going to see if you were overhyped or not. We're going to find out. If you're just an overhyped, decent fighter, Canelo's going to run through you. He showed that at 168. He's shown that throughout his career. The one guy he didn't run through is Gennady Golovkin. That correction didn't come with Gennady Golovkin. I would argue that you can make the case that Gennady Golovkin hasn't lost a fight in his career. You can make that case. You could also make the case that you thought he lost both Canelo fights, that he lost the Danny Jacobs fight, that he possibly lost to Derevyanchenko. But you can also make the case that Gennady Golovkin went through these guys and arguably doesn't have a loss on his resume. Another thing that is not debatable is Gennady Golovkin was a ducked fighter at middleweight. And I don't want to hear things about mandatory. Sergio Martinez did not want any parts of Gennady Golovkin. When my guy, Miguel Cotto, who I'm a huge fan of, became a middleweight champion, beating Sergio Martinez, and suddenly Gennady Golovkin's name was being brought up to him, Cotto started acting like he didn't know English all of a sudden. Yes, GGG was a monster, no doubt, great fighter. And you can go further. I mean, our guy Canelo, who I'm a fan of, waited about a year and a half before. But to his credit, unlike Sergio Martinez and Miguel Cotto, he fought Gennady Golovkin. You got to give Canelo credit there. And that adds to the narrative, right? That adds to Canelo's, that builds his legacy. It builds his legacy. It's a beautiful thing. If we give Gennady Golovkin the credit that he deserves, it actually enhances Canelo's legacy. But destroying, demeaning, devaluing the legacy of Gennady Golovkin, Triple G at middleweight, who was likely the best middleweight from 2010 to 2020. And I'm not saying he was Marvin Hagler. So if HBO was crazy there, I'll say that. But if we build them up, we also build up Canelo's legacy. But here, this adds to Gennady Golovkin's legacy. Look, Canelo Alvarez moves north after defeating Gennady Golovkin in the second fight. And what does he do? He runs through 168, runs through it. Then these fights started being mentioned at 175 and cruiserweight. When he said he wanted to move up to cruiserweight and fight a top 3 guy at cruiserweight, Vegas said that Canelo is still a minus 350 favorite. When Canelo signs to fight Dimitri Bivol, it says Canelo is a minus 350 favorite. When Joe Smith Jr.'s name is being brought up, minus 500 to minus 600 favorite. When Beterbiev's name is being brought up, Canelo is still a big favorite. So Vegas is saying that Canelo ran through 168, would be the odds-on favorite to become undisputed at 175, and would be an odds-on favorite to become undisputed at cruiserweight if he were to fight that schedule. The only guy in this picture who has given Canelo some problems is Gennady Golovkin. Once again, adding to Gennady Golovkin's stellar career. So I don't see how it is that we can bring Golovkin down. We've already covered he's been ducked at 160. I don't know of a better way to judge a fighter than to judge him against his peers in and around his weight class. So if he did better against Canelo than all these guys at 168, Vegas is saying he would do better against these guys even at 40 years old at 175, even cruiserweight. How is it that we're devaluing what Gennady Golovkin has done and brought to the table? And the reason I bring this up is one of the things people say is Gennady Golovkin doesn't deserve a third shot at Canelo Alvarez. So let's judge him against his peers. Who else is at 160 is fighting in a unification fight? It's just Triple G and Murata. What's 160 Charlo doing? Who's David Benavidez fighting? Lemieux? Golovkin's been there, done that. Bubu Andrade, really? So when these names are being mentioned, I mean, go to your casual fan neighbor and ask him who Dmitry Bivol is, ask him who Artur Beterbiev is. The reason I bring this up is because I'm told all the time it has to make business sense. When you see all these polls put out there of who you want to see Canelo fight next, and Golovkin's name isn't on there, Golovkin always wins the poll, and there's a reason. It's because the casual fans of all these names being mentioned, the casual fans only know Golovkin. And to Canelo's credit, he's helped in giving Golovkin that name. But that being said, they went 24 rounds. They went head to head. What and what? It was about 12 rounds to 12, if we're being honest. Both fighters showed that they were their equal at 160 at the time. Golovkin was likely slightly past his prime at the time when he was fighting Canelo, and Canelo was likely right before his prime, if we're being honest. I don't know of a fighter between 160 and 175 still to this day more deserving of a shot at Canelo than Golovkin, if we're being honest. I'd like to see fresh fights. I don't mind that. And I'm not criticizing anything Canelo does, because Canelo has built up that credibility. Canelo is lapping everyone right now, lapping everyone. And more on that tomorrow when we talk about pound for pound. And there is no case for anyone else being pound for pound champ right now than Canelo Alvarez. And it's going to take Canelo being upset by somebody to grip that pound for pound championship from him. All I'm saying is there's one guy in this whole picture, one guy who has proven to be a worthy adversary of Canelo Alvarez. All these guys are being gifted a shot. All these other guys are being gifted a shot. Triple G earned his shot the first time and the second time with Canelo. He earned his shot the first time by being avoided at 160, continuing to run through the top guys who were presented to him. And more on that in a minute. He earned the first shot with Canelo. More people than not felt he won that fight, so he earned his second shot with him. The second fight was still close. All right, so then we talk about a trilogy. I don't mind Canelo backing away from that and saying, I want to fight fresh names. But then when these fresh names don't do anything to deserve the shot and are just waiting for it to fall in their lap, and then Triple G comes around and says, and I understand Triple G hasn't been doing much the past 2 or 3 years, but when Triple G is in a unification fight at middleweight and nobody else between 160 and 175 besides Beterbiev and Joe Smith Jr. Later this summer is doing the same thing, Golovkin still stands out amongst his peers. I don't know how else to judge a fighter than comparing and contrasting him to his peers in and around his weight class. Another thing is he still has name recognition in that. Shout out to Nopal. Shout out to Nopal and shout out to Al Chile. When it comes to Golovkin, name recognition, and we talked about that. Name another fighter other than Canelo who has 2 super fights announced and scheduled this year. Golovkin's in a super fight in Japan against Murata. And if he wins that fight next weekend, he'll be in the biggest fight of the year, the trilogy fight with Canelo. So Golovkin is still doing things that other fighters aren't doing. Also, as I mentioned, he's in a unification fight at 160. How many fighters out there are in unification fights? Shakur Stevenson, Oscar Valdez. There aren't too many unification fights out there. Donaire, in a way, too. You know, they have some, but Golovkin's in one at middleweight. He's in a legitimate championship unification fight in his weight class. Other guys in the weight class aren't doing that. So he still has name recognition at 40 years old. He's still doing things that other fighters aren't doing. I understand the past 2 years haven't been so hot for him, but if he were to beat Murata in a super fight in Japan, he would have done more than all of his peers in and around the weight class to deserve the shot at the pound for pound king, Canelo Alvarez. All I'm saying, man, is if you paint this whole picture, it doesn't jive that Gennady Golovkin is an overhyped, overvalued fighter. It just doesn't. It just doesn't. And I understand the backlash that people give to Gennady Golovkin fans. As I said, fan bases can be annoying. Extreme fan bases can be very annoying. I was a Deontay Wilder fan, and then the Deontay Wilder fanboys started getting involved, and I'm like, whoa, what is this? So even I'm guilty of it. Even I'm guilty of it. But all I'm saying is, if you want to stay consistent, man, even if the fan base is annoying, even if you have to share a fan base with annoying fanboys, you got to keep it consistent. You got to keep it 100. And it doesn't do anything to Canelo's legacy to enhance it, to devalue Gennady Golovkin's legacy. It just doesn't. If we're going to say that Gennady Golovkin, the second fight, is Canelo's greatest victory, and then in the next sentence devalue Gennady Golovkin by saying he was an overhyped fighter, I don't see what that does for Canelo Alvarez. Gennady Golovkin has nothing to do with his rabid fan base, with the fanboys in his fan base. And by the way, I would have loved to have seen Twitter around when Bernard Hopkins was making his middleweight run, defenses after defenses after defenses, because I'm also being told that Gennady Golovkin should have moved up in weight instead of just fighting bums at middleweight. First of all, it worked out for him because it leveraged him into the Canelo Alvarez fight. So it worked out for him to stay at middleweight. But are we really going to say that Bernard Hopkins should have moved up in weight instead of staying at middleweight? And eventually the big fights came to him. And then he eventually moves up to fight Antonio Tarver, 2 weight classes, which is a boss move. Great move. And a great victory. But Gennady Golovkin moving up to 168 and fighting a guy who ran through 168 is a once-in-a-generation fighter, according to the Canelo fans, which I agree with. Love what Canelo's doing. And Vegas has him as the odds-on favorite to defeat everybody at 175, has him as the odds-on favorite to defeat all the champs at cruiserweight. Golovkin moving up and fighting Canelo Alvarez is a tougher fight than moving up and fighting Antonio Tarver. So we have to be honest with ourselves. If we're going to knock Golovkin for making the moves that he's made in the past, we have to knock Bernard Hopkins. Is that what we're going to do? I don't know, man. I just think that people let these fan bases get in their heads and they let it cloud their judgment. And in the process, they're actually demeaning their own fighters because they take away from their fighters' great victories when they talk about devaluing the other fighter, the opponent. Salute to Nopal. Canelo might do a boss move and say, let's do it at 175. And guess what? If he does, guess who needs to move up to 175? Golovkin. Because Golovkin's the clear B-side. I fully agree with you. It's the same thing that Kambosos is saying with Haney right now. You're going to take what I offer you. I'm the clear A side. And Kambosos is getting aggravating with that. Constantly saying he's the A side. And we'll talk about that in a podcast later this week as well. But Golovkin needs to make whatever concessions he has to make to get the third Canelo fight. It just is what it is. The facts are the facts. The reality of the situation is Canelo can call whatever shot he wants right now. Whatever shot he wants. He tells you to jump, how high? Canelo's earned that. But in the process of earning that is my point. The process of earning that, he had a great victory in the second fight against a great fighter in Gennady Golovkin. I don't understand for the life of me why we have to say anything but that. Why we need to say anything but that. Golovkin is a great, I don't know what he is at 40 years old. We're going to get a clearer picture of that against Murata next weekend. I tend to think that Golovkin and Canelo are going to have a tougher time than people think in the next fights. I think Golovkin's going to have a tough time of it against Murata in his next fight in Japan. I think that Canelo's going to have a tougher time with a guy who can jab and b-ball. Golovkin used the jab a lot against Canelo. Bivol is going to use the jab a lot. You better believe Bivol is going to be watching the Golovkin fights and trying to emulate what Golovkin is going to do. And he's going to have problems doing that because he doesn't have the killer instinct in the activity rate of Golovkin. But he can use the jab. The CompuBox says that he can use the jab. And Golovkin had success with the jab against Canelo. But he's going to have a tougher time against Murata, and Canelo's going to have a tougher time against Bivol. So we're almost acting like September is already here, and it's going to happen. There are two problems. One, both these fighters have to win. I have more confidence in Canelo winning his fight than I do Triple G winning his fight, if I'm being perfectly honest. And then we have to hope that neither one of these fighters gets an injury in the fight, in two tough fights, and no cuts. It's a big ask. It's a big ask. June, July, August, September is 4 months. We got to hope that these guys go through it unscathed. I think Murata beats GGG and throws a wrench in the Canelo. It's possible. It's possible. The good thing for Canelo, if that happens, is Canelo has options. And Canelo is going to quickly pick somebody else, and we're all going to watch it. We're all going to pay for the pay-per-view. It's going to be more beautiful things for Canelo. But the boxing public, if you look at every single poll, and more casuals know Triple G, that's the fight that people want, whether people like it or not. And it's because Triple G over time has built up that credibility. And you can't do that if you're not a great fighter. You can't. That correction is going to come at some point. When you fight Canelo twice, and we know who Canelo is now. Canelo is a killer. Canelo is a generational fighter. Canelo is doing exceptional things. He is a man amongst boys in a man's sport. That's the best way I could put it. I mean, he's running laps around other alphas. That's how alpha he is. So when you look at the full picture recently and you see he's only had trouble with one guy, he's only had trouble in 2 fights, and that's Gennady Golovkin. We got to give Gennady Golovkin his credit. We got to give him his just due. I don't understand the revisionist history. It doesn't make sense to me on a lot of levels. The only way I can make sense of it is, like I've been saying, the fanboys are getting in people's heads. The hype of HBO, what they were doing with Golovkin, saying that he's the next Marvin Hagler. You know, if we're saying he's overhyped because of that, then maybe it makes sense a little bit. But he's a great fighter. Great career. If Murata wins, will Canelo take the Murata fight? Canelo has said he wants to fight possibly in Japan, possibly in UK, so why not? Right? I mean, it'd be awesome to see Canelo in Japan. It'd be awesome to see Canelo fight in the UK. It would be awesome to see Canelo fight in Mexico. I'd love to see all that. Go on the Canelo Grand Tour, you know, like a great rock band, do the whole world. I'd love to see that. So yeah, if Murata wins, if he upsets Triple G, especially if he does it in exciting fashion, yes, give me that fight in September. If he beats Bivol, which I expect him to do, I think it's going to be a little tougher than people think. But if he does, give me that fight. GGG should have gotten his due when he beat Canelo in the first fight. Second fight was a draw. I see a lot of that. And that's what I'm saying, man. To me, I can only go off of how I scored it. I had Triple G beating him in the first fight. I had Canelo edging him in the second fight. I thought through 24 rounds, these guys were what and what? 12 rounds to 12 rounds. And that's something to say, given that I thought that at the time, I thought Triple G was slightly past his prime at the time. So you're talking about a guy slightly past his prime who was right there with a generational fighter in Canelo. Whew. I don't see how you say anything else but he's great. And I mean, I'm looking at the facts. I've gone over them. The odds, when you talk about Canelo fighting everybody from 168, 175 cruiserweight, he's the odds-on favorite. Yet Triple G went head-to-head with him. Martinez didn't want any parts of him, despite what people say about mandatories. Cotto, my guy, didn't want any parts of him. When they mentioned of him moving up to 168, my guy, Carl Froch, didn't want any parts of him. I got to be honest. And Andre Ward sends him a deal after Madison Square Garden is packed for Lemieux, despite what people tell you, despite what Andre Ward tells you about offering him a deal and he didn't take it. All of it's nonsense. It's nonsense. He was an avoided fighter. He was a great fighter. And guess who stepped up to the plate and fought him at middleweight? Canelo Alvarez. That's the narrative that people should be pushing right now. Cotto didn't want the fight. Martinez didn't want the fight. Gennady Golovkin was fighting everybody who was available to him at the weight at the time. Canelo comes up, beats Miguel Cotto, and he says, it took him a little while. It took him about a year, but he says, you know what? I'm going to do what Cotto and Martinez didn't do. I'm going to give this guy who is seen as the boogeyman at middleweight his shot. And he did. And many people felt he lost the fight, but guess what? He got the draw. He gave him a rematch. He went 24 rounds with one of the pound-for-pound heaviest punchers in the sport. And he got a draw, and he got a decision in the second fight. He went 24 rounds with the boogeyman at middleweight. This is the narrative that Canelo fans should be pushing instead of the narrative that Triple G is this overvalued fighter, that Triple G was this hype job. I don't understand why they do this, because it takes away from Canelo's legacy. And we don't want to take away from Canelo's legacy. Canelo is a gem in the sport. You should be able to, even if you're not like me, who is a fan of Canelo and Triple G, one of the few, more of a fan of Canelo than Triple G, but I'm one of the few who is a fan of both of them. I don't get it. We should be building up Canelo's legacy. And a way to do that is we build up the fighter who he beat at middleweight, who nobody wanted to fight. And it's arguably his career-defining win up to this point. Undisputed, being undisputed at 168, it may be a greater achievement, but his greatest single win is likely the second fight against Golovkin. And why are we demeaning and devaluing that win by devaluing Gennady Golovkin, who was clearly avoided at middleweight and is the only fighter who was competitive against Canelo Alvarez in recent history? That right there proves his value. We will see if a fighter is overhyped over time. We will be able to tell. And if a guy is if his peers are telling him that he's a tough fighter by not fighting him, because we can tell a lot about his fighters by the peers in and around his weight classes. So if Sergio Martinez, despite what people say about the mandatory, didn't want any parts of him, if my guy Miguel Cotto didn't want any parts of him, and then Canelo Alvarez finally gives him a shot at middleweight, and then he goes 24 rounds with Canelo Alvarez. They go about what and what. That proves his worth right there. That proves his worth. And he's arguably gone through Canelo twice, Danny Jacobs, Derevyanchenko. I understand there are people who feel like he had 4 losses right there, but you could also make the argument that he's gone through his career and doesn't have any losses. You could also make that argument. Is this episode or can we talk other fights? Look, man, I don't have much time. So we're going to talk about a lot of fights tomorrow in an upcoming pocket. Then GGG haggles with negotiations for 2 years, aging himself out. Look, I think Canelo wanted fresher names, and that's fine. Canelo has earned that. This isn't me blaming one fighter over the other. This is me praising both fighters. And I feel like we should be able to do that. Like GGG will dismantle Murata. We'll see. GGG around that time could have stopped Froch easily. Possibly. Quite possibly. I think it would have been a tougher fight than people think. It would have been a tougher fight than people, because people always do that thing with Froch, right? Like Froch in that 12-fight run he had, Froch was an underdog, I believe, 9 times in that 12-fight run he had. And he won 10 of those fights, 10 of the 12. So if we're talking about an undervalued fighter, I can't think of a more undervalued fighter than Carl Froch when he was active. He was just underdog after underdog after underdog and kept winning. So I bring that up because people do these mythical matchups with Carl Froch, and they say, this guy would have beat Carl Froch. Calzaghe would have beat Froch. Canelo would have destroyed Froch. This guy would have destroyed Froch. That guy would have destroyed Froch. Oh, he's slow and plotting. When Froch was the underdog in all these fights, he was winning all these fights. So maybe, just maybe, we're undervaluing Carl Froch still when it comes to mythical matchups. That's all I'm saying. But kind of getting off topic there. My whole point with this, 2 points. I'll say 3 points. Gennady Golovkin was a great fighter. There's no need to do the revisionist history. Number 2, I think the reason the revisionist history exists is because it's backlash to a lot of HBO saying that he was Marvin Hagler and all this stuff. And because of Triple G's hardcore fan base. And I think it's people more reacting to that. And in order to get back at Triple G's rabid fan base on the extreme side, they try to bring Triple G's legacy down. But number 3, we should be able to praise both fighters, because in doing so, we actually praise Canelo and bring up his legacy, because we cannot say that Triple G was a hype job and then say Canelo beating him in the second fight was his great victory. We just can't. We can't say that Triple G was this hype job, yet Canelo struggled with him for 24 rounds. I wouldn't say struggle, but went bat to bat with him for 24 rounds. We can't say that. We just can't do it. It's just lazy. It's just lazy. It's wanting your cake and eating it too. It's wanting to say that Canelo is this generational fighter, which he is, but at the same time, getting back at the Triple G fan base by saying, oh, he sucks. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work. Chocolatito and Donaire. Chocolatito. They're both animals, and I will be talking about, and I talked about Donaire a lot yesterday and on Monday. And believe me, we're going to be talking about Chocolatito and Donaire a lot, particularly Donaire leading up to the Inoue fight. But I'm a Chocolatito guy. I just think that Chocolatito, when we're looking at this era of fighters, and we were just talking about undervalued when it comes to Carl Froch, Chocolatito fits that as well. What Chocolatito is still doing in the lower weight classes at this age is just nothing short of phenomenal. So we'll be talking about that a lot more, believe me. G is better than his low risk, high reward career reflects, but he wears his baby nuts on his sleeve. No Paul and Nando have to always take those slick shots at Triple G. Canelo has better resume than both. Better than both who? I'm not sure what you mean, better than both. I'm not sure what you're talking about, but Canelo has an incredible resume. There's no doubt about that. True, both great fighters. That's right. Choc and Donaire's resume are all versus prime fighters. Yes, and the lower weight class fighters do not get the respect that they deserve from beating tough opposition after tough opposition after tough opposition, because they aren't being rewarded with low risk, high reward fights early in their career like these other fighters are doing. In the upper weight classes, Canelo and GGG, both legends. Yes, Canelo more so. You see how that works? Like, we can both call them both legends, but still say that Canelo's resume is better, and Canelo is a generational fighter. We can still do it, man. How can I praise Golovkin when he got Canelo acting like King Kong? Is difficult, bro. They have really good resumes, but Canelo Canelo's got a great resume, man. No arguments here. Just phenomenal fighter. But as a recap, Golovkin, great fighter. We can back that up by how his peers in and around middleweight have acted around him the past 7, 8, 9 years. Also, he's the only fighter besides Canelo in boxing today who has 2 super fights scheduled. Super fight in Japan with Murata, super fight against Canelo if he's able to get past Murata. So he's doing something right, and he did something right in his career. Should he have moved up from middleweight? Obviously, he did the right thing since he stayed at middleweight, fought the top competition available to him until his big fight came against Canelo. Bernard Hopkins did a similar thing, stayed at middleweight. His big fight came to him with Oscar De La Hoya. Similar career path. So if we're going to do this thing where we criticize Triple G for not moving up from middleweight because he wasn't getting the big fights, when he did get a big fight with Canelo eventually, we have to do the same thing when it comes to Bernard Hopkins. Like I said, if Twitter was around when Bernard Hopkins was running through guys at middleweight and not getting the big fights, I wonder how Twitter would have reacted to that. Would it have been the same? I don't know. Eventually, Hopkins moved up and fought Antonio Tarver for a big fight, 2 weight classes. And Gennady Golovkin, if he's able to get past Murata, will move up and fight Canelo. It's a similar career arc, if we're being honest, and around the same age, right? Around 40 years old. If we're going to criticize Canelo, we got to criticize Bernard Hopkins in the same breath, right? Canelo's best win is versus who? Don't say GG because I think he lost and draw. I had him edging out, if I remember correctly, 115, 113 in the second fight, Triple G, but I clearly had Triple G winning the first fight. So if we're going off of the official result, Golovkin, number 2, is Canelo's best win. And that's one of my main points here is we can't say that Gennady Golovkin is a hype job, and in the very next sentence say that Gennady Golovkin, the second fight, is this great career-defining win. We can't do both. We can't do both. It's just, I mean, it's hypocritical. You can't do both. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't take a shot at Golovkin in that way and then say that that was Canelo's greatest victory of his career. You can't do it. It's impossible. It's defying gravity. It's impossible. You can't do it. And we're not going to do it here. Here, we'll build up Canelo's legacy by saying that Gennady Golovkin was a great fighter. And if we go by the official result, beating Gennady Golovkin in that second fight was a career-defining great victory against a great fighter, a great middleweight in Gennady Golovkin. That's what we're going to do here. We're going to build up both fighters. Marvin Hagler and Monzon were probably welterweights by today's second-day weigh-ins, possibly. That's true. Canelo also wasn't beaten by no Carl Frampton. Kovalev, a guy 2 weights up that killed a man who Donaire tried to go up 2 weight. Look, you're not going to get any arguments from me that Canelo's legacy and resume is great. I'll send you a scorecard average for the first fight, Calix. Send it to me on Twitter. Send it to me. I'd like to see it. Rigo and busted up by Inoue. What else we got? You can't put that guy above Canelo, LOL. If we're talking about Chocolatito, man, I'm telling you, when it comes to Chocolatito and Donaire, these guys are undervalued. I'm telling you, and it's because they're in the lower weight classes. And future videos on that topic, best believe me. Kovalev was a month from having a super fight where he was losing until the 11th round. And I'm not a fan of Donaire. And I'm a fan of Donaire. Gotcha. Kovalev won every round. Stop the lies. And I'm a fan of Canelo. As am I. And in being a fan of Canelo, I'm also a fan of Triple G, and we're going to build up both their legacies here. So I hope that I gave you an alternative narrative here, Canelo fans, and this is for the Canelo fans. The narrative you should be pushing, the narrative that you should not be pushing, is that Triple G was a hype job. Because in doing that, you say Triple G, the second fight, was a great victory, a career-defining victory for Canelo. And then in the very next sentence, you say Triple G was overhyped and doesn't deserve a third fight. And that doesn't hold up either, because Triple G winning a unification fight against Murata, if he were to do that next weekend in a super fight, is more deserving of a shot of against Canelo than anybody at 168 and 175 is doing up to this point, quite honestly. But Turbiev and Joe Smith Jr., will be able to do a similar thing, but that will be not till June or July. Up to this point, if Triple G were to beat Murata, he has done more to earn the shot, another shot at Canelo, than any of these other guys between 160 and 175. And I rest my case. That's all I got. I appreciate y'all tuning in. More of the Up Jab tomorrow and more on Twitter. I am on Twitter at CalixBoxing2. The Morning Minute will be coming in the afternoon later on today. I'm out, man.